Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
There are certain cases in the chronicles of crime which, even in their initial presentation, possess that quality of the impossible that challenges not merely the detective's skill, but the very foundations upon which rational men build their understanding of the natural world. The affair which I have set down as the case of the candle that dripped upwards was such a case, presenting from its very outset a phenomenon so contrary to the laws of physics that even my friend Sherlock Holmes, that most rational of men, paused in his initial examination to verify what his eyes reported. It was on a particularly dense November evening in 1891 that Inspector Lestrade arrived at our Baker Street lodgings, his usually confident demeanour replaced by something approaching genuine bewilderment. The fog had settled over London like a grey blanket, muffling the familiar sounds of the city and lending an otherworldly quality to the gaslit streets below. Holmes had been engaged in one of his chemical experiments, the acrid smell of which had driven me to seek refuge in my armchair with the evening paper when Mrs. Hudson announced our visitor. "Gentlemen," Lestrade began without his customary pleasantries, settling heavily into the chair opposite Holmes, "I find myself confronted with circumstances so extraordinary that my usual methods have proven entirely inadequate. Indeed, I begin to question whether we are dealing with a matter for Scotland Yard at all, or whether it might not be better suited to the attention of theologians or natural philosophers." Holmes set down his test tube with deliberate care, his grey eyes immediately sharpening with interest. "From your manner of ascent upon our stairs, Inspector, and the particular way you've clutched your hat throughout this introduction, I deduce you've encountered something that has fundamentally disturbed your understanding of cause and effect. The slight tremor in your left hand suggests you've witnessed something that contradicts the very laws of nature as you understand them." Lestrade's mouth fell slightly agape. "How in blazes did you know that, Mr. Holmes?" "Elementary observation, my dear fellow. But pray, enlighten us with the particulars of this case that has so thoroughly unsettled your scientific convictions." The inspector leaned forward, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. 2 nights past, Sir Reginald Blackwood was found dead in his locked study at Blackwood Manor in Hampstead. The circumstances surrounding his death are so bizarre that my constables are beginning to speak of supernatural intervention. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, that familiar gesture indicating his complete attention. Sir Reginald Blackwood, the antiquarian and collector of Egyptian artifacts, a man of considerable wealth and even greater eccentricity. Continue. The gentleman was discovered by his housekeeper, Mrs. Pembroke, seated at his escritoire as if he had simply ceased his work and expired. The room was locked from within, the key still in the lock. Every window was secured with its original latches, showing no signs of tampering. The physician, Dr. Hartwell of Hampstead, pronounced it a natural death, likely cardiac in nature, though Sir Reginald was but 52 and had shown no previous signs of ill health. "A locked room mystery," I observed. "Surely not unprecedented in your experience, Inspector?" "No, Dr. Watson, that alone would not have brought me to Baker Street in such a state. It is what we discovered upon that desk that defies all rational explanation." Lestrade paused, as if gathering courage to voice what he was about to say. "There was a candle, gentlemen, a simple beeswax taper in a brass holder, positioned near Sir Reginald's right hand. It had been burning, that much was evident from the shortened wick and the pool of wax in the holder's basin." "But the wax, Mr. Holmes?" His voice faltered. "Yes?" Holmes prompted, his tone encouraging despite the intensity of his gaze. The wax had dripped upward, not down, as nature demands, but upward, forming small stalactites that reached toward the ceiling. Some drops had even adhered to the ceiling itself, as if gravity had been temporarily suspended in that room alone. The silence that followed this declaration was profound. Even Holmes, that most unflappable of men, sat motionless for several moments, his piercing eyes fixed upon some distant point, as his remarkable mind grappled with this apparent impossibility. "You are certain of what you observed?" Holmes finally asked, his voice carrying an unusual note of gravity. "I have examined it myself, sir, as have 3 of my most experienced constables and Dr. Hartwell. The evidence is incontrovertible. The candle wax has formed formations that appear to defy the fundamental law of gravity. My men are thoroughly unnerved, and I confess that I am at a complete loss to explain how such a thing could occur through any natural means." Holmes rose from his chair and began that familiar pacing that always accompanied his most intense periods of concentration. "Tell me, Inspector, what was Sir Reginald's state of mind in the days preceding his death? Had he any enemies, any recent changes in his circumstances or behaviour?" According to his household staff, he had been increasingly agitated in recent weeks. He had returned from Egypt some months ago with a collection of artefacts that he'd been studying obsessively. His nephew, Mr. Charles Blackwood, visited frequently and reported that his uncle had become convinced he was on the verge of some momentous discovery. The servants noted that he had taken to working through the night, often not retiring until dawn. "And the room itself? You mentioned it was locked from within. What of the fireplace, the chimney?" "The fireplace had not been used that evening, sir, though the weather was quite chill. The flue was examined and found to be clear, but far too narrow for human passage. There was no disturbance of the soot, or any indication that anyone had attempted entry by that route." Holmes ceased his pacing and fixed Lestrade with an intense stare. "I assume you have preserved the scene exactly as it was discovered?" "Indeed, sir. Though I must warn you that the household staff refuses to enter the study. They believe the room to be cursed, and after witnessing that impossible candle, I find their superstition somewhat understandable." "Superstition, Inspector, is merely ignorance dressed in the garb of explanation. There is no curse at work here, only a mind sufficiently clever to manipulate physical evidence in a most ingenious manner." Holmes turned to me with that familiar gleam of anticipation in his eyes. "Watson, I trust you are prepared for another adventure. We depart for Hampstead at first light." As Lestrade took his leave, promising to meet us at Blackwood Manor the following morning, I found myself staring into our own fireplace, trying to imagine by what possible means anyone could cause melted wax to flow upward against the pull of gravity. Holmes, meanwhile, had returned to his chemical apparatus, but I noticed his movements had acquired that particular energy that always preceded his most brilliant deductions. "Holmes," I ventured, "surely you don't believe someone actually managed to reverse the natural flow of melted wax?" He looked up from his work, with a slight smile playing about his lips. "My dear Watson, I believe someone has gone to considerable trouble to make it appear that they accomplished precisely that impossibility. The question that now occupies my mind is not how such a feat was achieved, but rather why someone felt compelled to create such an elaborate and seemingly supernatural tableau around Sir Reginald Blackwood's death." The fog continued to press against our windows as Holmes worked late into the night, and I found myself wondering what extraordinary revelation awaited us in the locked study at Blackwood Manor, where a candle had apparently chosen to defy one of nature's most fundamental laws. The morning brought little respite from the previous evening's oppressive atmosphere, though the fog had lifted sufficiently to reveal the skeletal outlines of London's awakening streets. Holmes maintained an almost complete silence during our journey northward, his sharp profile etched against the carriage window as he observed the passing cityscape with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize as the prelude to his most brilliant deductions. Only once did he break this contemplative quiet, and then to demonstrate, with characteristic precision, the very faculty upon which we were about to rely. A milk vendor had paused near our cab to adjust his yoke, and Holmes murmured without turning from the window, "Former naval man, recently dismissed from shore duty rather than sea service." When I protested the seeming impossibility of such a deduction, he smiled slightly. "Observe the tar stains on his cuffs, Watson, old but distinct. Note also the peculiar shine on his right boot alone, where a foot has rested habitually upon a polished rail or step. He has been standing at attention, but indoors, not upon a ship's deck." Blackwood Manor emerged from the thinning mists like some brooding sentinel, its Georgian facade of red brick and white stone speaking of both prosperity and scholarly refinement. Yet there was something in its austere appearance that seemed to reflect the mysterious circumstances that had brought us here. Inspector Lestrade awaited us beneath the columned portico, his usually confident demeanour still marked by the bewilderment that had driven him to Baker Street. "The household remains in considerable distress," Lestrade informed us as we approached the entrance. "Mrs. Pembroke, the housekeeper, who discovered the body, has taken to her bed with nervous prostration, though she managed to provide a statement before collapsing entirely. We were admitted by a thin, nervous gentleman whom Lestrade introduced as Mr. Pemberton, Sir Reginald's secretary and general factotum. The man's hands trembled perceptibly as he shook ours, and his eyes darted frequently toward the upper floors of the house, as if he expected some supernatural manifestation at any moment. The interior of Blackwood Manor reflected its owner's scholarly pursuits with remarkable thoroughness. Egyptian artifacts occupied places of honor throughout the entrance hall, their ancient surfaces seeming to watch our progress with unseeing eyes. Hieroglyphic inscriptions adorned various decorative elements, and a massive stone scarab dominated a pedestal near the main staircase. Sir Reginald was most passionate about his recent discoveries, Mr. Pemberton offered, in barely a whisper, as we ascended toward the study. He returned from his last expedition to Egypt convinced he had uncovered something of tremendous significance. He spoke often of ancient secrets, though I confess I understood little of his theories. The study door stood at the end of a long corridor, its heavy oak panels somehow more forbidding than any barrier I had previously encountered. Lestrade produced his key with evident reluctance, and as the lock turned, a stale, airless scent drifted out, mingled with something faintly metallic and the lingering aroma of beeswax. The room itself was a scholar's sanctuary, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes and filled with the accumulated treasures of a lifetime spent in archaeological pursuits. Ancient pottery, bronze implements, and carved stone figures occupied every available surface, creating an atmosphere that seemed to transport the visitor across millennia. Yet it was the large mahogany desk near the room's single window that immediately commanded our attention. There, exactly as Lestrade had described, stood the impossible candle. The brass holder contained the expected pool of solidified wax, but rising from this base were delicate formations that defied every law of physics I had ever studied. The wax had indeed flowed upward, creating graceful stalactites that reached toward the ceiling like the desperate fingers of some ancient supplicant. Several drops had somehow adhered to the plaster above, frozen in their impossible ascent. Holmes approached the phenomenon with the measured steps of a man entering a cathedral, his keen eyes taking in every detail. He circled the desk slowly, occasionally leaning close to study particular formations, but taking scrupulous care not to disturb anything. From beneath the escritoire he retrieved a snapped wooden match, unlit, examining it briefly before slipping it into his waistcoat pocket. His gaze travelled to the cold fireplace, where I noticed a curious speckling of fresh soot upon the grate bars, though none had fallen upon the hearth tiles below. "Interesting," he murmured, plucking what appeared to be a greyish filament from the fender and rolling it thoughtfully between his fingers before adding it to his collection of evidence. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of Holmes's movements and the distant sounds of the household below. I found myself staring at the impossible candle, my medical training utterly inadequate to explain this violation of natural law. "Holmes," I said quietly, "surely there must be some rational explanation for this phenomenon?" He straightened from his examination, his grey eyes holding that familiar glint of intellectual excitement that always appeared when confronted with a truly challenging puzzle. "Indeed there must be, Watson. The question is whether we possess sufficient wit to discover it before our mysterious adversary strikes again." Holmes resumed his methodical examination of the study with the precision of a surgeon, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail that might illuminate the mystery before us. He began at the door itself, kneeling to inspect the brass key that still protruded from the inner lock. Through his magnifying glass I observed him studying faint radial scratches around the keyhole, as if some implement had been drawn repeatedly across the metal surface. More intriguing still was a minute crescent of what appeared to be wax or soap lodged in the seam between the escutcheon and the wooden panel. "Most illuminating," he murmured, touching the substance with his fingertip and bringing it to his nose. The slight frown that crossed his features suggested this discovery had added another layer to an already complex puzzle. Moving to the window, Holmes examined each latch with meticulous care, confirming Lestrade's assertion that they remained secure and undisturbed. Yet his attention lingered on the windowsill, where he carefully shifted a volume from a nearby stack to reveal a narrow line of displaced dust. Within this groove lay what appeared to be a single grey hair, though when Holmes lifted it delicately on his knife blade, it crumbled with a powdery, fibrous quality quite unlike any natural hair I had encountered. His gaze travelled upward to the ceiling, where among the impossible stalactites of wax he noted two barely visible pinpricks in the cornice, spaced perhaps 2 feet apart, with a faint discoloration between them like the smudge of a gloved hand. Drawing a chair to the desk, he mounted it and touched one of the inverted wax drops with his handkerchief. The formation broke with a brittle crack rather than the yielding consistency of recently cooled wax, and when he examined the residue on his handkerchief, a whisper of soot darkened the linen, accompanied by that same metallic tang we had noticed upon entering. "Watson," he said, descending from the chair, "observe the positioning of Sir Reginald's spectacles." He indicated the wire-rimmed glasses resting precariously on a stack of books near the desk, well beyond the reach of a man seated at his work. Not upon his person, nor within convenient grasp. This suggests a sudden cessation of activity rather than the gradual decline one might expect from natural causes. At that moment, we heard brisk footsteps in the corridor, and a fair, handsome gentleman of perhaps 35 entered with the easy assurance of one accustomed to deference. Lestrade introduced him as Mr. Charles Blackwood, Sir Reginald's nephew, though I noted how the young man's confident demeanour faltered momentarily when his gaze fell upon the impossible candle. "I trust this melodrama will conclude swiftly," Charles said, recovering his composure. "There are pressing matters of estate to address." Holmes regarded him with mild interest. "Your uncle's melodrama, sir. Were you on cordial terms?" The nephew's mouth tightened slightly. "As cordial as possible with a man who preferred ancient stones to living relatives, We had disagreements about certain sales he was considering. There was an excellent offer from an American collector, and that scholar Mortlake from the museum had shown considerable interest, though Uncle Reginald managed to insult him quite thoroughly last Thursday. Holmes's attention had drifted to a conspicuous square of polished wood on the desktop, its naked surface contrasting sharply with the fine film of dust that coated the surrounding area. In its center, a faint ring suggested the recent presence of some metal apparatus. "What occupied this space?" he inquired of Mr. Pemberton, who had remained hovering nervously at the threshold. "A laboratory stand of sorts, sir," the secretary replied in barely a whisper. "Like a frame with adjustable clamps. Sir Reginald had been arranging small glass tubes upon it for some experiment he would not explain. It has vanished entirely." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then turned back to Charles Blackwood. "When did you last visit your uncle?" "Yesterday morning, for perhaps half an hour. I have nothing to conceal in that regard." After Charles departed with obvious relief, Holmes drew Pemberton aside for more detailed questioning. The secretary's agitation intensified as he revealed that Sir Reginald had received several visits in recent weeks from a mysterious gentleman named Aldrich Crane, who claimed scholarly interest in Egyptian antiquities but possessed an unsettling, almost predatory manner. "When did you last see this Mr. Crane?" Holmes asked, with sharpened attention. 3 days ago, sir. He remained until well past midnight, and I heard raised voices from the study at one point. The following morning, Sir Reginald seemed deeply troubled and dismissed me early that evening, saying he wished to work undisturbed. "The very evening he died," Holmes observed quietly, his grey eyes holding that familiar glint of intellectual excitement that always preceded his most brilliant revelations. The revelation of Aldrich Crane's involvement had clearly struck a chord with Holmes, though his expression remained carefully neutral as he pressed Pemberton for additional details. The secretary's account painted a picture of a man both scholarly and unsettling, possessed of genuine expertise, yet harbouring an underlying quality that had made the entire household uncomfortable during his visits. Mr. Crane was perhaps 40 years of age, tall and spare, with prematurely grey hair and remarkably pale eyes, Pemberton explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He spoke with the authority of genuine scholarship, yet there was something predatory in his manner. He claimed particular expertise in ancient Egyptian rituals and possessed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of Sir Reginald's own field of study. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then requested to examine the servant's bell system. In the narrow passage below stairs, we found the brass indicator for the study positioned in a curious state of half-tension, neither fully fallen nor properly reset. When Holmes attempted to adjust it, the mechanism resisted his touch with an unusual stiffness. "Has this bell rung recently?" he inquired of Pemberton. "Once, sir, on the night Sir Reginald died, between 2 and 3 in the morning, according to Mrs. Pembroke. The staff was too frightened to respond at such an hour." Holmes traced the bell wire to its terminus, discovering along its length the same grey, fibrous substance we had encountered elsewhere. When pinched between his fingers, it crumbled like ash, leaving a faint, metallic residue upon his skin. This discovery prompted a slight smile of satisfaction, as if another piece of his developing theory had fallen into place. Our interview with Mrs. Pembroke, though she remained considerably shaken by her ordeal, provided crucial details about the morning of discovery. The robust housekeeper, propped upon her pillows with rosary clutched tightly in her hands, described entering the study at precisely 8 o'clock to find the door locked from within. "The keyhole itself seemed obstructed," she recalled with a shudder. "My master key would not turn properly, as if something had been wedged within the mechanism. There was a peculiar sour tang in the air, like metallic smoke, and the room felt unnaturally cold despite the mild weather outside. Holmes leaned forward with intense interest. "You mentioned the cold. Was this unusual for Sir Reginald's study?" "Indeed, sir. He always maintained a comfortable temperature, particularly when working late. Yet that morning I could see my own breath when I spoke, though the corridor remained quite temperate." This atmospheric detail seemed to provide Holmes with another crucial element, for he immediately returned to examine the keyhole more closely. Using his magnifying glass, he confirmed the presence of waxy residue that had clearly been inserted deliberately to obstruct the mechanism, requiring heat to soften it sufficiently for entry. As we continued our investigation, Pemberton provided additional intelligence about the mysterious Mr. Crane. The man had visited frequently over recent weeks, often remaining until well past midnight, and their discussions had grown increasingly heated. Sir Reginald had spoken of Crane's unscrupulous methods and dangerous theories, particularly regarding certain papyrus documents that had apparently vanished from Sir Reginald's private safe. The combination was known only to Sir Reginald himself, Pemberton explained, yet the lock shows no signs of forcing. Among the missing items was a papyrus covered with unusual diagrams and formulas, which Sir Reginald believed contained ancient knowledge of natural forces. Holmes examined the safe with characteristic thoroughness, confirming the absence of tool marks while discovering within its recesses a single drop of that same grey substance, now hardened into a brittle pellet. When crushed, it released a faint, chemical odour that seemed to satisfy some developing hypothesis. Our investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Mortlake from the British Museum, a distinguished gentleman of perhaps 50 years, whose pallor spoke of long hours spent among ancient artifacts rather than in natural sunlight. Though he claimed to have come upon hearing the tragic news, I noticed how his gaze was immediately drawn to the impossible candle with an expression combining scientific fascination and something approaching fear. "Sir Reginald and I had our differences," Dr. Mortlake admitted, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the desk, "but he was a scholar of genuine accomplishment. This phenomenon defies every principle of natural philosophy." Holmes observed this new arrival with the careful attention of a naturalist studying an interesting specimen, noting particularly how the scholar's composure seemed shaken by the sight of those upward-flowing wax formations. "Indeed, Dr. Mortlake," Holmes replied quietly, "it would appear that someone has gone to considerable trouble to create an impression of supernatural intervention. The question that now occupies my mind is whether we are dealing with genuine scholarly rivalry or something far more calculated and dangerous." The afternoon light was beginning to fade as Holmes prepared for what I sensed would be the next crucial phase of our investigation. The revelation of Aldrich Crane's involvement had clearly crystallized Lestrade's thinking, and I observed with growing concern how readily the inspector embraced what appeared to be an obvious solution to our puzzle. As Holmes continued his methodical examination of the study, Lestrade paced with renewed confidence, his earlier bewilderment replaced by the satisfaction of a hunter who believes he has identified his quarry. "This Crane fellow is our man, Holmes," Lestrade declared with conviction. "The motive is clear as daylight. Theft of valuable antiquities escalating to murder when Sir Reginald resisted. The locked room, this impossible candle business, it's all theatrical nonsense designed to throw us off the scent while he made his escape." Holmes, meanwhile, had returned to his examination of the fireplace, kneeling to study the grate bars with his magnifying glass. He scraped what appeared to be a metallic bead from the underside of the centre bar, then carefully extracted a minute fragment that gleamed dully in the afternoon light. This he pocketed without comment, though I noticed his slight frown of concentration deepening. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, the complete absence of ash upon the hearth tiles, despite clear evidence of combustion above. Whatever burned here did not fall downward as nature demands. Lestrade, overhearing this observation, brightened considerably. "Exactly my point, Mr. Holmes. Crane thrust something up the chimney, a flare perhaps, to create this supernatural nonsense and frighten the old gentleman. Pure theatrics." Holmes's response was characteristically measured. "Or to achieve an effect that required an upward rather than downward distribution of combustion products." He rose from his examination and fixed Lestrade with a penetrating gaze. "Tell me, Inspector, can you locate Mr. Crane without delay?" "Already set a man to it," Lestrade replied with satisfaction. "The name's uncommon enough. We should have his address before nightfall." "Excellent. Have your man also inquire at the photographic suppliers in Holborn and Tottenham Court Road. Ask whether a gentleman of scholarly bearing has purchased magnesium powder, flash sheets, or insulated wire within the past fortnight." Lestrade stared in bewilderment. "Photography, Mr. Holmes? What possible connection could that have to this witch's trick?" "Perhaps nothing," Holmes replied with that slight smile that indicated significant mental progress. "Perhaps everything." He had moved to examine the bell wire where it entered the study, noting how the insulation appeared blistered in one location, bearing that same grey, ashy residue we had encountered elsewhere. "You mentioned the bell rang once between 2 and 3 that morning, then stuck half-fallen." When Pemberton confirmed this detail, Holmes nodded with satisfaction. "A bell may record not only a deliberate pull, but an electrical current." Dr. Mortlake, who had observed these proceedings with growing unease, cleared his throat nervously. "Surely you cannot seriously suggest that Sir Reginald converted his bell wire into some form of electrical apparatus. He possessed no such technical knowledge." "Genius is not required for imitation, Doctor," Holmes replied quietly. "A practical mind, clear instructions, and access to modern photographic equipment will suffice admirably." The museum scholar's pallor increased noticeably at this observation, though he attempted to maintain his composure. "I am a man of books, Mr. Holmes. My pursuits do not extend to such theatrical pyrotechnics." Holmes offered a slight bow that seemed almost apologetic, yet his grey eyes had acquired that distant quality that indicated rapid mental calculation. He returned once more to examine the impossible wax formations, this time noting how they fractured with a brittle snap rather than the yielding consistency of natural beeswax, leaving a dark, sooty residue rather than the translucent quality one would expect. As the afternoon light continued to fade, Lestrade's confidence in his theory grew correspondingly stronger. "We'll issue a warrant for Crane's arrest immediately," he announced. "A man doesn't simply vanish with stolen antiquities. My constables will scour every lodging-house and antiquarian shop in London, if necessary." Holmes listened to this declaration without objection, though I detected that subtle reservation in his manner that indicated significant mental reservations. When Lestrade departed to organize his manhunt, Holmes turned to me with an expression that combined satisfaction with concern. "Watson, we are witnessing the construction of a most elaborate deception, one designed not merely to conceal murder, but to direct suspicion toward a carefully chosen scapegoat. The question that now occupies my mind is whether Mr. Crane is our theatrical murderer's intended victim or his unwitting accomplice." The gathering dusk seemed to emphasize the ominous implications of this observation, and I found myself wondering what revelations the coming evening might bring. As evening settled over Blackwood Manor, Holmes requested several items from the household: a length of fine thread from Mrs. Pembroke's sewing basket, a small hand mirror, and most crucially, access to the gas supply that fed the study's reading lamp. With these simple materials, he proceeded to demonstrate what I would later recognize as one of his most elegant expositions of criminal methodology. Working with the precision of a natural philosopher, Holmes first examined the thread under his magnifying glass, confirming its composition as common cotton before setting it aside. From his waistcoat pocket, he withdrew one of the grey, fibrous strands we had discovered throughout the crime scene, holding it delicately between his fingers. "Observe, Watson," he said, applying the flame of a match to the mysterious substance. Rather than burning with the steady glow of natural fibre, it flared with intense, white heat, leaving behind a metallic residue that gleamed dully in the lamplight. "This is not thread at all, but finely drawn magnesium wire designed to burn at extraordinary temperatures while maintaining structural integrity long enough to serve our murderer's purpose." He moved to the brass candle holder, inverting it to reveal what I had previously overlooked. A minute hole drilled through the base, so small as to be nearly invisible to casual inspection. With his knife point, he traced the path where a wire might have been threaded through this opening, up through the candle itself, and secured to some point above. "The mechanism is ingenious in its simplicity," Holmes continued, his grey eyes alight with professional admiration. "A thin wire of this magnesium compound, heated by electrical current, would create sufficient temperature to melt wax and draw it upward through capillary action. The wire itself, being consumed in the process, leaves no trace save these metallic fragments." The demonstration was interrupted by the arrival of a constable bearing news that would have satisfied Lestrade completely had the inspector been present to receive it. Aldrich Crane had indeed been located at modest lodgings in Red Lion Street, where a search of his quarters had revealed not only several artifacts matching descriptions of items missing from Sir Reginald's collection, but also a complete apparatus for photographic work, including magnesium ribbon, electrical batteries, and coils of the same insulated wire we had discovered in the study's bell system. "Most convenient," Holmes murmured upon hearing this intelligence, though his tone suggested reservation rather than satisfaction. "And Mr. Crane's explanation for these materials?" "Claims they're for legitimate photographic experiments, sir," the constable reported. "Became quite agitated when confronted with the missing artifacts, demanding a solicitor and maintaining complete ignorance of Sir Reginald's death." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then surprised both the constable and myself by requesting that we return immediately to Baker Street rather than remaining to witness what appeared to be the case's resolution. As our hansom cab wound through London's gaslit streets, I ventured to express my confusion at this apparent withdrawal from triumph. "Holmes, surely the evidence against Crane is overwhelming. The missing artifacts, the photographic equipment, his known disputes with Sir Reginald." "Indeed, Watson, the case against Mr. Crane appears admirably constructed," he replied, though his tone carried none of the satisfaction one might expect. "Perhaps too admirably constructed for a man intelligent enough to devise such an elaborate method of creating supernatural appearances." Upon reaching our familiar lodgings, Holmes immediately set about analyzing the various fragments he had collected, subjecting each to chemical tests with the methodical precision that characterized his most important investigations. The grey, fibrous material proved to be exactly what his demonstration had suggested, magnesium wire of a type used in photographic work, though of unusually fine gauge. The metallic beads from the fireplace grate contained traces of aluminum powder, which when ignited would create both spectacular illumination and considerable heat directed upward. The entire apparatus was designed to create a single, overwhelming impression of supernatural intervention, Holmes explained as he worked. The electrical current, supplied through the modified bell wire, heated the magnesium filaments to incandescence. These, in turn, melted the specially prepared candle wax and drew it upward through capillary action, while simultaneously creating that eerie, cold atmosphere Mrs. Pembroke described. Our analysis was interrupted by an urgent knocking at our door, followed by Mrs. Hudson's announcement of Dr. Mortlake. The museum scholar entered in a state of considerable agitation, his usual composed demeanour entirely abandoned. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "I understand someone has been arrested in connection with Sir Reginald's death. I felt compelled to inform you that the situation may be far more complex than it appears." Holmes gestured toward a chair, his keen eyes noting the tremor in our visitor's hands and the perspiration upon his brow, despite the evening's chill. "Pray enlighten us, Doctor. I confess that certain aspects of this affair continue to puzzle me." Sir Reginald had made a discovery of extraordinary significance, Mortlake continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. A papyrus containing what appeared to be ancient formulas for manipulating natural forces through what we would now recognize as primitive electrical and chemical principles. He believed it represented genuine Egyptian knowledge that anticipated modern scientific understanding by millennia. "And you desired access to this document?" Holmes inquired with deceptive mildness. The scholar's composure cracked entirely. For scholarly purposes, naturally, the historical implications were staggering. However, Sir Reginald had become increasingly secretive, even paranoid, about his research. He accused me of attempting to steal his discoveries, which was entirely unjust. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his attention now completely focused upon our agitated visitor. "When did you last see Sir Reginald alive, Dr. Mortlake?" "2 nights ago," came the barely audible reply. "We quarrelled about the papyrus. He threatened to expose what he called my unethical methods to the museum authorities. I departed in anger, but I swear he was alive and well when I left." The silence that followed this confession was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of London's evening traffic. Holmes sat motionless for several moments, his grey eyes fixed upon some distant point, as his remarkable mind processed this new intelligence. "Dr. Mortlake," he said finally, "I believe you may be in considerable danger." The gravity of Holmes's warning struck Dr. Mortlake with visible force, his scholarly composure dissolving entirely as the implications became clear. He gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles whitened, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid as he processed what my friend had suggested. "Danger," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But surely with Crane in custody the matter is resolved. The evidence against him appears overwhelming." Holmes resumed his characteristic pacing, his grey eyes distant with concentration. "Consider, Doctor, the extraordinary sophistication required to orchestrate the supernatural tableau we discovered in Sir Reginald's study. The precise knowledge of electrical principles, the careful preparation of chemical compounds, the meticulous timing required to achieve such effects. Does this suggest the work of a common thief driven by desperation, or rather the methodical planning of a mind both brilliant and utterly ruthless?" Before Dr. Mortlake could respond, Mrs. Hudson announced another visitor. Charles Blackwood ascended our stairs with considerably less confidence than he had displayed at the Manor, his usual assured demeanour replaced by something approaching genuine distress. "Mr. Holmes," he began without his customary pleasantries, "I understand there may be questions about this Crane fellow's guilt. I felt compelled to provide information that I perhaps should have mentioned earlier, though at the time it seemed merely another example of my uncle's increasing eccentricity." Holmes paused in his pacing, his attention immediately focused. "Pray continue, Mr. Blackwood. Any additional intelligence would be most welcome." My uncle had grown increasingly paranoid in recent weeks, convinced that someone was systematically stealing his research. He had taken to working entirely alone, dismissing even Pemberton from the study during his evening sessions. On my last visit, he showed me an elaborate security apparatus he had installed throughout the room. This revelation brought Holmes to an immediate halt, his keen eyes sharpening with intense interest. "Security apparatus? Describe it precisely, if you please." Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Hidden cameras, electrical recording devices, even a system for capturing conversations without the knowledge of his visitors. The equipment was concealed behind false panels in the study walls, all connected to the main electrical supply through that modified bell system you examined." Uncle Reginald was quite proud of his precautions, though I thought them rather excessive for mere scholarly materials. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me, and I could see the pieces of his developing theory clicking into place with almost audible precision. "And the current location of this recording equipment? That is precisely what troubles me, Mr. Holmes. When I searched the study this morning, hoping to locate my uncle's will, all trace of the apparatus had vanished. The hidden panels had been carefully restored, the electrical connections severed and concealed with remarkable skill. Someone with intimate knowledge of my uncle's security measures had systematically removed every piece of evidence that might have revealed the true circumstances of his death." Dr. Mortlake had grown increasingly agitated during this exchange, rising from his chair to pace in obvious distress. "This confirms my worst fears," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Sir Reginald suspected everyone, trusted no one. If he had indeed recorded our final conversation, if there existed proof of our quarrel—" Holmes stopped his pacing abruptly, fixing both men with that penetrating stare that seemed to see through to their very souls. "Dr. Mortlake, you mentioned that Sir Reginald threatened to expose your unethical methods to the museum authorities. What specific activities was he referencing?" The scholar's remaining composure cracked entirely under this direct inquiry. "I had approached certain private collectors offering to authenticate artifacts of questionable provenance in exchange for access to their collections. Nothing illegal, you understand, merely ethically ambiguous. Sir Reginald discovered these arrangements and threatened to destroy my reputation unless I ceased all such activities immediately." "And yet," Holmes observed with deceptive mildness, "you continued to visit him to argue about access to his papyrus discoveries. A man in your position could not afford public scandal, particularly involving questions of professional integrity." Charles Blackwood listened to this exchange with growing alarm. "Are you suggesting that Dr. Mortlake might have been involved in my uncle's death? But the evidence against Crane seems so conclusive." "The evidence against Crane," Holmes replied, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction, "has been carefully orchestrated by someone far more clever than Mr. Crane himself. Consider the sequence of events. Dr. Mortlake quarrels with Sir Reginald, providing clear motive for revenge. That same evening, Sir Reginald dies under circumstances so bizarre as to suggest supernatural intervention. The following day, Aldrich Crane is discovered with stolen artifacts and photographic equipment that perfectly explains the mysterious phenomena we observed. Holmes moved to his chemical apparatus, withdrawing the various fragments he had collected during our investigation. The true mastermind of this affair has demonstrated remarkable foresight. They possessed detailed knowledge of Sir Reginald's security measures, sufficient technical expertise to create elaborate electrical and chemical effects, and most crucially, the cold calculation necessary to position not one, but potentially two, scapegoats for their crime. Dr. Mortlake had grown deathly pale during this recitation. "You cannot seriously suggest that I possess the technical knowledge to create such elaborate deceptions. I am a scholar of ancient history, not a practitioner of modern science." Holmes smiled that thin, predatory smile that always preceded his most devastating revelations. "Indeed, Doctor, you are quite correct. You lack the necessary technical expertise. However, you do possess something equally valuable to our true perpetrator: intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's habits, his security measures, his research, and, most importantly, access to his study during the very hours when the fatal apparatus was being installed." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of London's evening traffic. Holmes continued with relentless logic. "The missing recording equipment represents the final piece of this elaborate puzzle. Our true criminal needed those recordings eliminated not merely to conceal their own involvement, but to ensure that any evidence of Dr. Mortlake's quarrel with Sir Reginald could be presented in the most damaging possible light when the time came to shift suspicion from the convenient Mr. Crane to an even more convenient secondary suspect." Charles Blackwood stared in fascination and horror. "You mean someone has been manipulating events from the very beginning, positioning both Crane and Dr. Mortlake as potential culprits?" "Precisely," Holmes replied, his grey eyes gleaming with intellectual satisfaction. "We are dealing with a mind of considerable sophistication, one that delights in creating impossible scenarios while maintaining multiple avenues for misdirection. The question that now occupies my thoughts is the identity of this puppet master, and more urgently when they intend to complete their grand design." As if summoned by his words, Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door with obvious reluctance, announcing that a messenger had arrived with an urgent communication for Dr. Mortlake. Holmes was on his feet instantly, his entire demeanour sharpening with anticipation. "The game," he murmured with grim satisfaction, "appears to be entering its final phase." The messenger proved to be a telegraph boy whose nervous demeanour immediately caught Holmes's attention. The lad clutched a yellow envelope with the characteristic urgency of one who had been impressed with the vital importance of his errand, yet his eyes darted about our lodgings with the wariness of someone who sensed he might be delivering more than mere words. Dr. Mortlake received the telegram with hands that trembled so violently the paper rustled like autumn leaves. As he read its contents, what little colour remained in his face drained away entirely, leaving him with the pallor of a man who has glimpsed his own doom. The communication slipped from his nerveless fingers, fluttering to our carpet like a wounded bird. Holmes retrieved the telegram with characteristic swiftness, his keen eyes scanning its contents while simultaneously noting the quality of paper, the style of printing, and even the particular odour that clung to the message. "Most illuminating," he murmured, holding the paper to the gaslight. "Observe, Watson, the slight irregularity in the telegraph company's stamp, the unusual weight of the paper stock, and most tellingly, the faint aroma of that same myrrh and benzoin we encountered at Blackwood Manor." The message itself was brief but chilling in its implications. "Dr. Mortlake, your guilt in Sir Reginald's death is known. Meet me at the Roman bathhouse ruins near Southwark at midnight. Come alone or face public exposure. Your reputation depends upon compliance. A. Crane." Charles Blackwood stared at the telegram in bewilderment. But surely Crane remains in Lestrade's custody. How could he possibly have sent this communication? Holmes smiled with that cold satisfaction that always preceded his most devastating revelations. "He could not, Mr. Blackwood, which makes this message infinitely more valuable than its author intended. Our true adversary has grown impatient with subtle manipulation and has chosen to reveal themselves through direct action. Note the precise phrasing, the intimate knowledge of Dr. Mortlake's vulnerabilities, and most crucially, the selection of a meeting place that offers numerous advantages to someone planning an ambush." Dr. Mortlake had sunk into his chair, his scholarly composure entirely shattered. "This is the end of everything," he whispered. "Whether I attend this meeting or flee, I am utterly ruined. The mere existence of such accusations will destroy my career, my reputation, everything I have worked to achieve." "On the contrary, Doctor," Holmes replied, his grey eyes gleaming with anticipation. "This communication represents the key to your complete vindication. Our opponent has made their first significant tactical error by abandoning the elaborate misdirections that have served them so well. They have revealed not only their continued freedom of action, but their desperate need to eliminate you as a potential witness to their crimes." Holmes began that familiar pacing that always accompanied his most intense periods of concentration. "Consider the psychology at work here. Our criminal has successfully framed Aldrich Crane for Sir Reginald's murder, yet they remain unsatisfied with this achievement. They require Dr. Mortlake's destruction as well, not merely as additional misdirection, but because the doctor possesses knowledge that could potentially unravel their entire scheme." "What knowledge?" Charles Blackwood asked, his confusion evident. "The true nature of Sir Reginald's final discovery," Holmes replied. "Dr. Mortlake, you mentioned that your uncle had found a papyrus containing ancient formulas for manipulating natural forces. What specific details did Sir Reginald reveal about these discoveries during your final conversation?" The scholar struggled to compose himself sufficiently to respond. "He claimed the papyrus described methods for creating what appeared to be supernatural phenomena through the application of chemical and electrical principles. He was convinced that ancient Egyptian priests had possessed scientific knowledge that anticipated modern understanding by thousands of years. But surely such claims were merely the fantasies of an overexcited imagination." Holmes stopped his pacing abruptly, his attention now completely focused. "Or the foundation for a murder method so elaborate that it would appear impossible to any conventional investigation. Our criminal has not merely studied Sir Reginald's research, they have implemented it with deadly precision." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door with obvious reluctance, announcing that Inspector Lestrade had arrived with urgent news. The inspector ascended our stairs with considerably less confidence than usual, his weathered face bearing an expression of profound bewilderment. "Gentlemen," he began without preamble, "I bring disturbing intelligence. Aldrich Crane has been found dead in his cell, apparently from natural causes, though the circumstances are most peculiar. The prison physician reports no signs of violence, yet Crane's body was discovered in a state of complete rigidity, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror." The silence that followed this announcement was profound. Holmes remained motionless for several moments, his remarkable mind processing this new development with characteristic precision. "The final piece of our opponent's puzzle," he said at last, his voice carrying a note of grim admiration. "With Crane's death, all evidence of the elaborate frame against him becomes irrelevant. Dr. Mortlake now stands as the sole remaining suspect, a man with clear motive, opportunity, and intimate knowledge of both Sir Reginald's research and the manor's security arrangements." Dr. Mortlake stared in horror at this realization. "You mean Crane's death was not natural?" "I mean, Doctor, that our adversary has demonstrated a level of planning and ruthlessness that extends far beyond simple murder for gain. They have orchestrated a sequence of events designed to eliminate every potential threat to their ultimate objective, which I now believe extends far beyond mere theft of antiquities." Holmes moved to his desk and began assembling his equipment with swift efficiency, his revolver, a dark lantern, and several items whose purpose I could not immediately discern. "Watson, we shall indeed attend this midnight appointment, though not in the manner our correspondent expects. Dr. Mortlake will appear to comply with the instructions while we observe from concealment. Our puppet master has grown confident in their manipulation of events, but they have underestimated the pleasure I derive from turning such elaborate schemes against their creators. As the clock struck 11, Holmes surveyed our small group with that familiar gleam of intellectual excitement that always preceded his most dangerous adventures. "The game, gentlemen, has reached its climactic phase. Tonight we shall discover not merely the identity of our opponent, but the true scope of their ambitions and the ultimate purpose behind this most ingenious series of deceptions." The fog had thickened considerably during our preparations, lending an appropriately ominous atmosphere to our expedition as we prepared to confront whatever revelation awaited us in the ancient ruins by the Thames. The journey through London's fog-shrouded streets to the Roman bathhouse ruins carried an ominous weight that seemed to press upon our small party like a physical presence. Holmes had insisted upon a circuitous route, his keen eyes constantly scanning our surroundings for any sign that we were being observed or followed. Dr. Mortlake sat huddled in his corner of the hansom, his scholarly composure entirely shattered by the evening's revelations, while the fog grew thicker with each passing mile, transforming the familiar cityscape into something alien and threatening. As we approached Southwark, Holmes began his final preparations with the methodical precision of a military commander. From his coat he produced several items: his dark lantern with its adjustable shutter, a coil of fine wire, and a small flask containing what appeared to be a chemical compound of his own devising. Most significantly, he withdrew his revolver and checked its chambers with practised efficiency. "Watson," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the clatter of wheels on cobblestone, "our adversary has demonstrated remarkable technical sophistication. They will not come to this meeting unprepared, nor will they hesitate to eliminate any witnesses to their crimes. Dr. Mortlake's appearance of compliance is essential, but we must be ready to act decisively when the moment presents itself." The ruins emerged from the mist like the skeletal remains of some ancient leviathan, their crumbling arches and broken walls creating a maze of shadows and concealment. Holmes led us through the debris with an almost supernatural sense of direction, positioning each member of our party with tactical precision. Dr. Mortlake was directed to the central courtyard beneath the largest surviving archway, while Holmes and I took concealment behind a fallen column that commanded an excellent view of the entire site. As midnight approached, marked by the distant tolling of church bells across the Thames, a figure materialized from the fog with the fluid confidence of one entirely comfortable in this desolate setting. To my complete astonishment, the person who stepped into the pale moonlight was not Charles Blackwood or some unknown adversary, but rather Mr. Pemberton, Sir Reginald's mild-mannered secretary. Yet the transformation in his demeanour was so complete as to render him almost unrecognizable. Gone entirely was the nervous, subservient manner I had observed at Blackwood Manor. In its place stood a man of evident intelligence and authority, his bearing suggesting scholarly confidence rather than clerical timidity. Even his voice, when he spoke, carried a cultured precision entirely absent from his earlier diffident speech. "Dr. Mortlake," Pemberton called across the ruins, his words carrying clearly through the still air. "How punctual of you to honour our appointment. I trust my communication proved sufficiently compelling to ensure your attendance." Dr. Mortlake's voice cracked with shock and bewilderment. "Pemberton, but you are merely Sir Reginald's secretary. How could you possibly have orchestrated such elaborate deceptions?" The man who had masqueraded as a humble clerk smiled with cold satisfaction, and in that expression I glimpsed the true depth of his calculated ruthlessness. "Sir Reginald's secretary, yes, but also Dr. Marcus Pemberton, formerly of Cambridge University, dismissed for conducting unauthorized experiments in applied chemistry and electrical phenomena. My academic credentials, I assure you, are every bit as impressive as your own, though my interests have taken a rather more practical direction." Holmes's grip tightened on my arm, his attention completely focused on this revelation. Through the concealing mist, I could see him studying every detail of Pemberton's transformation, noting particularly how the man's hands moved with the practiced precision of one accustomed to delicate scientific work. "Sir Reginald never suspected my true identity," Pemberton continued, clearly savouring his moment of revelation. "He believed he had hired a simple clerk to manage his correspondence and maintain his filing systems. In reality, he had invited into his home a man whose understanding of the principles contained in his precious papyrus far exceeded his own limited comprehension." "You murdered him for his research?" Dr. Mortlake found his voice, though it trembled, with both fear and moral outrage. Pemberton's laugh was entirely devoid of human warmth. "When Cambridge destroyed my career, they also destroyed my access to the resources necessary for advanced research. Sir Reginald's collection, his laboratory, his scholarly connections, all became the tools I required to complete work that the narrow minds of conventional academia had deemed too dangerous to pursue." As this confession unfolded, I noticed that the fog itself seemed to be moving in unnatural patterns, and a faint phosphorescent glow had begun to emanate from various points among the ancient stones. Pemberton was clearly manipulating some form of chemical apparatus concealed throughout the ruins, creating atmospheric effects designed to intimidate and disorient his victim. Holmes had begun to move with that cat-like stealth that characterized his most dangerous moments, using the concealment of the fog to position himself closer to the confrontation. I could see him studying the distribution of the phosphorescent effects, clearly identifying the locations of Pemberton's hidden devices with the methodical precision that marked all his investigations. The papyrus contained far more than mere historical curiosities, Pemberton declared, his voice taking on the fervent quality of the true fanatic. It described methods for controlling natural forces through the precise application of chemical compounds and electrical currents. The ancient Egyptians had discovered principles that our modern science is only beginning to understand. At that moment, Holmes chose to reveal himself, stepping from the shadows with his revolver drawn and trained upon the false secretary. "Dr. Marcus Pemberton, I presume, expelled from Cambridge not merely for unauthorized experiments, but for the theft of university property and the endangerment of fellow scholars through reckless chemical trials." Pemberton whirled toward this new voice, his scholarly composure cracking for the first time since his dramatic transformation. "Sherlock Holmes, I should have anticipated your eventual involvement, though I confess I had hoped my elaborate misdirections would prove sufficient to satisfy even your legendary deductive abilities." "Your misdirections were indeed ingenious," Holmes replied, advancing carefully while maintaining his aim. "The framing of Aldrich Crane was particularly sophisticated, though his subsequent murder in custody revealed the true extent of your ruthlessness. You could not risk his eventual testimony about the true source of those stolen artifacts. Crane possessed inconvenient knowledge about certain transactions involving Sir Reginald's collection," Pemberton explained with clinical detachment. "His continued existence represented an unacceptable risk to my long-term objectives." The confrontation had reached its critical moment, with Holmes and his quarry facing each other across the phosphorescent-lit ruins, while Dr. Mortlake cowered behind a crumbling wall. Yet I sensed that Pemberton retained some final stratagem, some ultimate application of his stolen knowledge that would serve as either his escape or his revenge. Holmes evidently shared this intuition, for his next words carried a note of urgent warning. "Dr. Pemberton, I strongly advise you to surrender immediately. Whatever device you have prepared as your final gambit, I assure you that its effects have been anticipated and countered." Pemberton's smile was that of a man who believes himself to hold the ultimate advantage. "Have they indeed, Mr. Holmes? Then you will not object to a small demonstration of the practical applications of ancient Egyptian science." He raised his hand toward a concealed apparatus among the ruins, but Holmes was already in motion, his dark lantern flashing once in a pre-arranged signal. From the shadows came the sound of Lestrade's whistle, followed immediately by the rush of constables converging on our position from multiple directions. Pemberton's final gambit, whatever its nature, was destined to remain forever unrevealed as the forces of justice closed around him with inexorable precision. The convergence of Lestrade's constables created a moment of desperate calculation in Pemberton's scholarly mind, and rather than submit to capture, he lunged toward a concealed apparatus among the ancient stones. His hand found a hidden switch, triggering a cascade of brilliant chemical flares that transformed the ruins into a scene from some supernatural nightmare. Magnesium ribbon ignited in sequence along the crumbling walls, while phosphorescent compounds cast an eerie, greenish glow across the archaeological site, accompanied by clouds of acrid vapor that burned the throat and eyes. Holmes had anticipated this final gambit with characteristic foresight. "Down, Watson!" he commanded, while simultaneously signaling Lestrade's men, who approached with dampened cloth pressed to their faces as previously instructed. Through the swirling chemical fog, I glimpsed Pemberton making his escape attempt toward the Thames, his scholarly frame moving with surprising agility across the treacherous footing of broken stones and ancient masonry. The chase led us through a maze of crumbling archways toward the riverbank, where Pemberton had clearly positioned a small boat for precisely this contingency. Yet Holmes's tactical preparation proved superior, for as our quarry splashed into the dark water, the sound of police whistles echoed from downstream, confirming that Lestrade's river police had indeed anticipated this avenue of escape. "Dr. Marcus Pemberton?" Holmes called across the water, his voice cutting through the night with commanding authority. "Your elaborate performance has reached its conclusion. I suggest you surrender with whatever dignity remains to a man of your former academic standing." The splashing ceased, followed by a silence so profound we could hear the gentle lapping of Thames water against the ancient embankment. When Pemberton finally waded back toward shore, his scholarly composure had returned, even in defeat, though his eyes held the cold resentment of a brilliant mind outmaneuvered by superior intellect. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Holmes began his methodical explanation of the deception that had baffled Scotland Yard and created the illusion of supernatural intervention. "The candle that appeared to drip upward, Inspector, was achieved through an ingenious application of scientific principles that would have impressed the ancient Egyptians themselves." Dr. Pemberton threaded a finely drawn magnesium wire through a specially prepared beeswax candle, connecting it to an electrical current supplied through Sir Reginald's modified bell system. Holmes retrieved one of the grey, fibrous fragments from his pocket, demonstrating how it flared with intense white heat when ignited. When heated by electrical current, this magnesium wire burned at extraordinary temperatures while maintaining structural integrity long enough to melt the surrounding wax. The intense heat created upward convection currents, while the wire itself acted as a wick, drawing the molten wax upward through capillary action against the natural pull of gravity. The wire, being consumed in the process, left only these metallic fragments as evidence of its existence. Dr. Mortlake, still shaken by the evening's revelations, found his voice. "But the locked room, the apparent impossibility of entry or exit?" Dr. Pemberton possessed intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's security arrangements, Holmes continued, his grey eyes reflecting satisfaction at the puzzle's complete resolution. "The hidden panels that Charles Blackwood described were known to our false secretary, who had helped install them under the guise of assisting with Sir Reginald's elaborate recording apparatus. These panels provided concealed access to the study, allowing Pemberton to enter, commit his crime, activate his electrical apparatus, and depart through passages unknown to the household staff. Holmes turned his attention to the broader criminal scheme. The murder itself was carefully timed to coincide with the activation of the magnesium wire system. Sir Reginald, working alone in his study, as had become his habit, was likely poisoned with a compound that induced rapid cardiac arrest. The electrical current was then activated remotely, creating the supernatural tableau that would mystify investigators while Pemberton established his alibi elsewhere in the household. Lestrade, still struggling to comprehend the technical aspects, asked about the missing artifacts found in Crane's possession. Holmes's explanation revealed the full scope of Pemberton's manipulation. Aldrich Crane was selected as the primary scapegoat due to his known disputes with Sir Reginald and his involvement in the antiquities trade. Pemberton planted the stolen artifacts among Crane's possessions, knowing that the discovery of photographic equipment, which Crane legitimately possessed for his scholarly work, would provide a convenient explanation for the supernatural effects. The murder of Crane in his cell was the final act of this elaborate deception. Holmes continued grimly. Pemberton could not risk Crane eventually proving his innocence or revealing the true source of the planted evidence. A carefully prepared compound, its prussic acid content masked with benzoin and myrrh, ensured Crane's silence while appearing to be natural death from shock and terror. As dawn broke over the Thames, casting pale light, across the ruins where Pemberton's chemical apparatus still smouldered, Holmes provided the final piece of his deduction. Dr. Mortlake was intended as the secondary scapegoat, should the frame against Crane prove insufficient. The telegram that brought us here tonight was designed to lure the doctor to his death, eliminating the last potential witness to Pemberton's crimes while providing a convenient explanation for the murder as either suicide from guilt or revenge from beyond the grave. Dr. Mortlake stared in horror at this revelation. "You mean I was never truly safe, even with Crane in custody?" "On the contrary, Doctor," Holmes replied with quiet satisfaction. "Your safety was assured from the moment I recognized the true nature of this deception. Pemberton's fundamental error lay in believing that complexity equates to invisibility. The more elaborate his supernatural tableau, the more physical evidence it necessarily left behind. Every chemical compound, every electrical modification, every carefully placed clue created a trail that led inexorably to the truth. As Lestrade's men led Pemberton away, the former Cambridge scholar paused to address Holmes with something approaching professional respect. "You have proven a worthy adversary, Mr. Holmes. I confess that I underestimated your ability to see through such elaborate misdirection to the underlying scientific principles." "Science, Dr. Pemberton," Holmes replied evenly, "is indeed morally neutral, as you observed. Its value lies entirely in the character of those who wield it. You chose to employ genuine knowledge in service of murder and deception, while I have applied similar principles in service of justice and truth." The fog continued to lift as London awakened to another day, and I reflected upon how this most impossible of cases had yielded to the methodical application of logic and observation. The candle that had appeared to drip upward had been revealed as an ingenious illusion, but the human capacity for both brilliant creativity and moral corruption remained as mysterious as ever. Holmes had once again demonstrated that no deception, however elaborate, could withstand the persistent application of reason and the unflinching pursuit of truth. As we departed the ancient ruins, now stripped of their supernatural terror, and revealed as merely the stage for human ambition and criminal ingenuity, Holmes made one final observation. "Watson, we have witnessed the application of ancient wisdom corrupted by modern methods. It serves as a reminder that progress in knowledge must always be accompanied by progress in wisdom, lest we create monsters more terrible than any the ancients ever imagined." The immediate aftermath of Dr. Marcus Pemberton's arrest brought a curious mixture of relief and contemplation to our small party gathered among the ancient ruins. As Lestrade's constables methodically collected the ingenious apparatus that had created such supernatural terror, I observed how the morning light gradually dispelled the last traces of phosphorescent glow from the crumbling stones, reducing Pemberton's elaborate theatrical effects to mere chemical residue and scorched metal. Dr. Mortlake, still pale from his brush with destruction, approached Holmes with the profound gratitude of a man whose reputation had been salvaged from complete ruin. "Mr. Holmes, I cannot adequately express my debt to you. Without your intervention, I would have faced either death or disgrace, neither of which my conscience could have borne." Holmes acknowledged this gratitude with characteristic reserve, though I detected in his manner a genuine satisfaction at having prevented such an injustice. Charles Blackwood, meanwhile, stared at the departing figure of his uncle's former secretary with the bewilderment of one who had lived unknowingly in the presence of calculated evil. Our return journey to Baker Street was conducted in contemplative silence, broken only by Holmes's occasional observations about the technical aspects of Pemberton's scheme. As our hansom wound through London's awakening streets, he began to piece together the final elements of the deception with that methodical precision that had made him the terror of the criminal classes. "The timing mechanism was perhaps the most crucial element, Watson," he explained as we settled into our familiar sitting room. "Pemberton would have administered a slow-acting poison to Sir Reginald, calculated to take effect within a predictable time frame. The electrical apparatus concealed within those hidden panels Charles described was activated by a simple clockwork timer, ensuring the supernatural display would commence well after the actual death, providing our false secretary with an unshakable alibi." He moved to his chemical apparatus, withdrawing the various fragments we had collected during our investigation. The magnesium wire, when heated by electrical current, burned at temperatures sufficient to melt the specially prepared beeswax, while maintaining structural integrity long enough to draw the molten wax upward through capillary action. The wire itself, being consumed in the process, left only these metallic traces as evidence of its existence. "But surely," I ventured, "such elaborate preparation must have required considerable time and technical knowledge." "Indeed, Watson, which brings us to the true tragedy of this affair. Dr. Marcus Pemberton possessed genuine scientific brilliance, corrupted by academic disappointment and personal resentment into the service of murder. His dismissal from Cambridge for unauthorized experiments had clearly festered into a desire for revenge against the scholarly establishment that had rejected him. The weeks that followed brought a fascinating study in the administration of justice and the restoration of damaged reputations. Dr. Mortlake returned to his museum duties with renewed humility and dedication, while Charles Blackwood, inheriting his uncle's considerable estate, chose to donate the entire collection of Egyptian artifacts to the British Museum, declaring that such treasures belonged in the service of genuine scholarship rather than private obsession. The trial of Dr. Marcus Pemberton provided London's newspapers with sensational copy for months, as the details of his ingenious deception were revealed to an astonished public. His confession, delivered with the same scholarly precision he had once applied to legitimate research, detailed not only the technical methods of his crimes, but the gradual moral deterioration that had transformed a promising scientist into a calculating murderer. Holmes was called to testify regarding the scientific principles involved, and his demonstration of the magnesium wire technique created considerable sensation, among both the legal community and the scientific establishment. Several academic journals requested detailed articles describing the methods, though Holmes declined all such invitations, maintaining that such knowledge was better restricted to those with legitimate scholarly interests. The mysterious papyrus that had sparked Sir Reginald's final obsession was never recovered, despite thorough searches of Pemberton's lodgings and exhaustive questioning during his trial. Holmes suspected it had been destroyed once Pemberton had extracted whatever knowledge it contained, though he acknowledged the possibility that it remained hidden somewhere, awaiting discovery by future scholars or criminals. "Perhaps it is for the best," he observed one evening, as we sat before our fireplace, the familiar comfort of our lodgings, a welcome contrast to the supernatural terrors we had recently confronted. Ancient wisdom, as we have seen, can prove dangerous in the wrong hands. The Egyptians may have possessed knowledge that our modern world is not yet prepared to handle responsibly. Inspector Lestrade emerged from the affair with his reputation considerably enhanced, though he freely acknowledged that without Holmes's intervention, the case would have resulted in a grave miscarriage of justice. The inspector's newfound appreciation for scientific method led him to establish new procedures for examining crime scenes, incorporating many of the observational techniques he had witnessed Holmes employ. As winter settled over London and our familiar routine resumed its comfortable pattern, Holmes received an unexpected visitor in the form of a representative from Cambridge University. The gentleman had come to offer Holmes a position in their natural philosophy department, recognizing that his unique combination of scientific knowledge and practical application might prove valuable to future generations of students. Holmes declined the offer with characteristic brevity, though not without a certain wry amusement. Academic life, Watson, requires a degree of patience with conventional thinking that I fear I lack entirely. My methods are better suited to the immediate demands of criminal investigation than the measured pace of scholarly discourse. Yet I detected in his manner a certain satisfaction at the recognition, as well as a renewed appreciation for the legitimate applications of scientific knowledge. The case had reminded him that his own unusual talents served a purpose beyond mere intellectual exercise, providing society with protection against those who would pervert learning for destructive ends. On a particularly foggy evening in December, as Holmes worked at his chemical bench while I attended to my correspondence, he made an observation that seemed to encapsulate the deeper lessons of our recent adventure. The ancient Egyptians believed that knowledge was a sacred trust, Watson, to be passed down only to those who had demonstrated both intellectual capacity and moral worthiness. Dr. Pemberton possessed the former in abundance, but entirely lacked the latter. It serves as a reminder that education without character is perhaps the most dangerous combination human society can produce. As the clock struck midnight and London settled into the quiet hours before dawn, Holmes set aside his apparatus and reached for his violin, drawing from its strings a melody both haunting and contemplative. In those notes I heard an echo of the ancient wisdom that had sparked such tragedy, transformed now into something beautiful and harmless through the alchemy of art rather than the corruption of criminal ambition. The case of the candle that dripped upwards had reached its conclusion, but its lessons would remain with us always. The impossible had been revealed as merely improbable, the supernatural reduced to the ingenious application of natural law, yet the human capacity for both brilliant creation and moral corruption remained as mysterious as ever. Holmes had once again demonstrated that no deception, however elaborate, could withstand the methodical application of reason and observation, while reminding us that the greatest mysteries often lie not in the phenomena that capture our imagination, but in the choices that define our character. As I prepared to retire for the evening, leaving Holmes to his nocturnal contemplations, I reflected that we had witnessed not merely the solution of a criminal puzzle, but a profound meditation on the responsibilities that accompany knowledge and the eternal struggle between wisdom and ambition that shapes the human condition. The candle that had appeared to defy gravity had been revealed as an illusion, but the truths it had illuminated about human nature would endure long after its impossible flames had been extinguished forever.